La diffusion vient de démarrer. Tous les participants sont en mode écoute seule.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the 6th National Report Technical Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us today. This is the 5th webinar in this series, and today we will focus on gender mainstreaming, women's empowerment, and biodiversity conservation. My name is Marion Marigot. I am the French-speaking technical specialist for the 6th National Reports Project for UNDP. We have discussed this for the past month now. The 6th National Report must be high quality, data-driven, and gender responsive. We want to emphasize the importance and relevance of involving women in the reporting process and more generally in any activities towards biodiversity conservation. The previous webinar on stakeholder engagement already led to interesting discussions on how to involve women's group and networks as stakeholders in the 6NR process. Today, our speakers will provide more specific and technical guidance on how to do so and ensure your 6NR is indeed gender responsive. So to do so, we're today welcoming 3 speakers: Tanya McGregor, the Gender Program Officer at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, will provide an overview of the work of the CBD on gender mainstreaming. Tanya has a background in international development and environmental science and worked with the Global Affairs Canada for 10 years. She has also worked with IUCN in South Africa in supporting sustainable natural resource management enterprises and has worked with a number of Canadian environmental NGO in program coordination roles. We will then welcome Pilar Jacobo, who is the Subdirector of International and Regional Affairs in the Climate Change Strategy Office for the National Commission of Protected Areas in Mexico. She will provide an overview of the work made by Mexico on gender, including in the National Strategy for Biodiversity and the 6NR. Pilar has experience working at the national, subnational, and local levels. And currently, she's guiding the implementation of several regional and international projects regarding mitigation and adaptation programs for a protected area in Mexico, while promoting different ways to achieve gender equality. And finally, we will welcome Mrinalini Rai, Tina, who is from the Global Forest Coalition, who will provide concrete examples of gender mainstreaming. Mrinalini, or Tina, has several years of experience working with Indigenous people and local communities, including with women on issues concerning natural resource management and environmental politics, with a special interest in protected area governance, migration, and their impact on conservation, and gender relations. Tina is part of a wider civil society network and was one of the 4 members of the Global Environmental Facility Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. So following this, as we usually do, we will have a questions and answers session, and you can ask your questions directly to our speaker. The presentation displayed in this session are in English, but from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. New York time today, we will host the same session in French. And on Monday, 4 June, from 2 to 4 p.m. New York time, this session will be also hosted in Spanish. As you know, there are 2 ways to communicate with us throughout the presentation. You can either virtually raise your hand and I will open your mic so you can directly ask your questions to the speakers. And the second thing you can do is to type your question into the chat box and I will read it out loud. So let's start now. I am pleased to welcome Tanya McGregor as our first speakers. Over to you, Tanya.
Thanks very much, Marion, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. And I'm just going to move on with my slides. So I just, for the objectives for my presentation are to start off with a bit of an introduction to relationships between gender and biodiversity, for those of you who may be less familiar with these interconnections. Also to provide an overview of key gender elements under the convention and to highlight some gender issues relevant to the Aichi targets and actions that can be taken to address them. And this in the context of supporting your reporting process for the 6NR. So gender considerations for biodiversity. To be effective over the long term, efforts to conserve, sustainably use, and share the benefits of biodiversity must address social, economic, political, and cultural factors that influence use, access to, and control of biodiversity. So gender can be seen as a useful and important basis for analysis in addressing social, economic, and political considerations because gender differences are a characteristic common to every society. Examining gender differences and inequalities provides information and insight into how different people value, use, access, and make decisions about biological resources. Considering gender differences, capacities, and inequalities can also serve as a starting point to examine the impact of other relevant factors that distinguish different groups, such as age, race, ethnicity, religion, and income class. As you can see in this slide, gender differences, capacities, and inequalities relate to the different roles and responsibilities, knowledge, needs, priorities, rights, decision-making power, and vulnerabilities of women and men. These dimensions influence the use and conservation of biological resources, as well as how changes in biodiversity may affect women and men in different ways. So I'll go into the relationship of gender issues with biodiversity further in the next slide. So gender differences, different roles of women and men and boys and girls means that they rely on biodiversity and ecosystem services such as food, water, and land in different ways and develop distinct biodiversity knowledge. Women and men therefore have different capacities to contribute to biodiversity targets and are also vulnerable to changes in ecosystems and biodiversity management in different ways. In respect to gender inequalities, globally, women's rights and access to land, biological resources, and other productive assets is much less than that of men. These gender gaps also exist in relation to education, technology, services, as well as decision-making and natural resource management at all levels. Gender roles are often at the root of these inequalities. For example, women's time constraints, such as due to domestic and childcare responsibilities, are linked to less engagement of women in biodiversity decision-making. So gender-responsive biodiversity policy and programming takes into account differences, gaps, and capacities in order to address unequal access to ecosystem services and biodiversity management, and build on the unique capacities of women and men in relation to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. So as you may, I want to introduce some of the key decisions on gender under the Convention on Biological Diversity. As you may be aware, there is the 2015-2020 Gender Plan of Action, which is the most significant decision and current action plan in place for the Convention. This provides a framework for the Secretariat to take actions and proposals for parties to integrate gender into their work under the Convention. The plan has 4 strategic objectives. These are to mainstream a gender perspective in implementation of the Convention and associated work of parties and the Secretariat, to promote gender equality in achieving the objectives of the Convention, the strategic plan for biodiversity, and the Aichi biodiversity targets, to demonstrate the benefits of gender mainstreaming and measures to achieve the objectives of the Convention, and to increase the effectiveness of work under the Convention. So under this plan, and in terms of this discussion, the most notable of the proposed actions for parties is to mainstream gender into national biodiversity strategies and action plans. This is closely linked to the other actions that are listed here on this slide, and that each of these other actions is also necessary to support the effective integration of gender considerations in the development and in the implementation of MBSAPs, and measures to conserve, sustainably use, and equitably share the benefits derived from biodiversity. So the Secretariat of the CBD has produced, in collaboration with partners, a variety of guidance on integrating gender considerations in MBSAPs. All of this is available in the gender page of the CBD website. The first 2 documents here are the technical series and the module on mainstreaming gender considerations. They provide information on steps involved in integrating gender in the development of MBSAPs, while the 3rd document, titled Integrating Gender Considerations in MBSAPs, highlights the process undertaken in a pilot initiative, which was carried out by the CBD Secretariat and IUCN's Global Gender Office with generous financial support from the government of Japan. And this was working with developing country partners to integrate gender in their revised MBSAPs. This document includes some useful considerations that emerge from this pilot process, and I believe which have relevance to many different country parties and other partners. So I'd encourage you to take a look at these if you have not already. And just to come back to the strategic plan and the Aichi targets, implementation of the strategic plan for biodiversity and the Aichi targets, as we know, provides a basis for reporting for the 6th national report. And as I've outlined earlier, gender differences and inequalities and roles and responsibilities and rights and knowledge and needs and decision-making power and in vulnerabilities all have implications for the valuation, for the use, the management, and the conservation of biodiversity at local and national levels. So considering and addressing these gender differences and inequalities can increase the effectiveness of measures aimed at achieving the biodiversity targets. This reinforces the message that gender considerations are relevant for all Aichi targets and need to be taken into account into the implementation of all targets. As we can see on this slide, under the COP decision that was taken at COP12, parties recognize the importance of gender considerations to the achievement of the Aichi targets. So in the next few slides, I'll talk a bit more detail about some linkages between gender and the different targets and some actions that can be taken to address these. So strategic goal A, addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity. If we take a look at target 1, which is talking about the awareness of values of biodiversity and how people can take steps to conserve and use it sustainably, one of the gender issues that is relevant in this case is that biodiversity often means different things to women and men because of their daily roles and their social norms. This means that they are more aware of and value different dimensions of biodiversity. For example, in rural areas, women often depend on harvesting biological resources such as food, medicine, and also for small-scale livelihood activities. Due to differences in use, women in Madre de Dios in Peru, like in many forest neighboring communities, tend to value fruits and other non-timber forest products more than men, while men attribute more value to timber species. So actions to address such differences include conducting sex disaggregated assessments of awareness and biodiversity issues. Sex disaggregated data collection is critical for informative reporting and can help refine messages for women and men of different ages and backgrounds. And this has value beyond the 2020 timeframe. Targeting women and men differently in sensitization campaigns and promoting equal access to education is another important action. Women and men may learn about and access information through different channels. In many rural communities, we know that women do not participate as fully as men in public meetings and in decision-making processes and may not be able to move far from home. They may not be able to access different technologies. They may have lower literacy levels. And as such, things like community radio may be more effective for reaching women in communities where women are less literate and spend more time near home in comparison to things like cell phone text messages or posters in public spaces, which may be more accessible to men. So strategic goal B, reducing the direct pressures on biodiversity and promoting sustainable use. And target 5 talks about the rate of loss of natural habitats, including forests, to ensure that it is at least half and where feasible brought close to zero with reduction in degradation and fragmentation. So the issues here that I want to point out include unequal participation or unequal voice in community-based natural resource management, where powerful groups may have the opportunity to dominate. Community-based natural resource management institutions do not always ensure proper representation of the different groups that make up a community, and without active measures, there is a tendency for more powerful groups like men to dominate these types of management groups. However, research has shown that at least in some regions, including women in forestry management groups, can improve resource governance and conservation outcomes. So among the actions to consider here are efforts to ensure that women and men are equally and actively engaged in natural resource management. This is both in natural resource management groups and in community consultations, so that their different needs and priorities and their specific knowledge can be taken into account. So goal C is referring to improving the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. And target 13 is relating to genetic diversity of cultivated plants and farmed and domestic animals. And the gender issues here include gender differences in species conservation. Women and men make distinct contributions to in situ conservation of genetic diversity, but these are not always recognized. In many settings, women cultivate and gather various local plants for household and subsistence use, while men may focus on cash crops for income generation. Women are also more likely to keep indigenous poultry and small ruminants rather than large livestock, and they typically have primary responsibility for home gardens, which are key to household food security and contain agrobiodiversity. Women further play an important role in the conservation of wild crop relatives. So actions to take into account these capacities and differences in use include supporting women as well as men in traditional in situ conservation. This is supporting the work of Indigenous and local women who safeguard traditional species, such as through seed selection, cultivation, animal rearing, and food preparation as viable strategies to limit genetic erosion. This starts with the process of supporting women in this process, and starts with a gender analysis, which should be based on sex disaggregated data where it is available and participatory consultations. Another important measure is to promote equality in tenure rights, creating policies that recognize the land rights of women, for example, by ensuring joint land titling to support in situ conservation efforts. So strategic goal D, enhancing the benefits to all from biodiversity and conservation and ecosystem services. And target 14 is the one IT target that does make an explicit reference to the needs of women. It talks about taking into account the needs of women as well as Indigenous and local communities and the poor and vulnerable in the safeguarding and restoration of ecosystems that provide essential services. So one of the important issues in respect to this target is gender roles and priorities with regard to ecosystem services. Both women and men in many countries often rely on ecosystem services for their livelihoods, but women tend to have fewer alternatives. Inequalities between women and men in access, control, and ownership of land and natural resources, as well as sociocultural barriers to economic opportunities for women, increase women's dependency on access to some ecosystem services. This subsequently increases their vulnerability to ecosystem degradation and access restrictions from conservation schemes. An example here is from Uganda, where women were found to be more affected by wetland degradation than men due to their use of wetlands for firewood, handicraft materials, water, and herbal medicine. So actions to be addressed here include conducting a gender analysis on the use of ecosystem services, analyzing, in this case, the sex disaggregated data, consulting women and men, how they depend on these services, and with the aim of identifying gender differences as well as gender gaps, and the distribution of costs and benefits of ecosystem degradation and restoration options. And then the next steps in that process are to use this data and this information to inform restoration and interventions to ensure that they can be gender responsive. Supporting equitable management or equitable participation in ecosystem management of institutions, of ecosystem management institutions is another important step. which includes implementing policies that ensure the equal participation of women and men in ecosystem management, and that can include such things such as mandatory quotas and training. Another element is improving women's land rights. Again, women's unequal access to land and all the ecosystem services associated with it, including water, food, natural resources, the right to have a say in governance structures. This is a major impediment to putting in place equitable conservation measures that are sustainable over the long term. So awareness campaigns on women's legal rights that target both women and men, including local leaders, are useful tools to promote the enforcement of these rights. And lastly, strategic goal E, to enhance the implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. So for target 20, we're looking at the mobilization of financial resources for effectively implementing the plan. And one of the issues here is that budgets are not gender neutral. Budgets need to take into account the specific needs and interests of women and men. Financial allocations are often thought of as having similar implications for women and men, but in fact, the different gender roles of women and men, as well as their often unequal access, as we've mentioned, to resources and services, mean that these allocations affect women and men differently. And one example is that many agricultural service programs and projects have failed to effectively reach both women and men farmers and to address the different obstacles they face. In many places, women have less access to agriculture extension services and thereby suitable seeds and other resources for farming. One action to address here is to adopt gender responsive budgeting. This involves accounting for the specific needs and interests of both women and men when conceiving and implementing budgets. And one example of putting resources towards elements that address women in natural resource management is the government of Liberia, and its MBSAP has allocated US $500,000 to microcredit projects supporting women's empowerment. So I just wanted to give a bit of a recap and overview of some of the measures we've highlighted here that can be taken to achieve a gender responsive approach to the targets and achieve the targets. These include collecting and applying sex disaggregated data, carrying out gender analysis and qualitative research to clarify differences in roles and values and behaviors, to ensure equal rights to use, access, control, and derive benefits, to promote equal participation and decision-making power between women and men, to take into account gender differentiated knowledge, needs, and priorities, and to allocate resources, including expertise and finance, to ensure gender responsive actions can be implemented effectively. So lastly, if we look at what this means for addressing gender in your 6 national reports, there's a number of steps that follow from the points I've just highlighted. And these are suggestions on how you may look at including gender issues and women's perspectives in drafting your report. These include such things as involving ministries of gender, women's affairs, and women's groups in stakeholder consultations, to seek inputs from both women and men in assessment of progress, including MBSAP activities, include sex disaggregated data related to the use, access, and control of biodiversity, including how benefits are distributed, ensure women's and men's contributions to implementation are included in the report, and engage gender expertise to assist in the development of the report, such as through supporting the inclusion of sex disaggregated data and analysis in the report. The report also provides an opportunity to provide examples of good practices and case studies that demonstrate gender and biodiversity outcomes or win-wins. And the 6th National Report is also the primary opportunity to report on actions identified for parties in the Convention's Gender Plan of Action, those which I listed on an earlier slide. And lastly, It also is an opportunity to highlight linkages with efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 5 and also the other related gender targets that fall under goals such as SDG 1 and 2 and many others. And this is something to consider as you work on your action plans and potentially any reporting for the Sustainable Development Goals, that there are definite linkages with this, the gender responsive efforts to implement MBSAPs. And with that, I will leave it there and give it back to Marion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for this presentation, for sharing your expertise and showing the linkages in between gender and the strategy goals. And this last slide is actually a very good transition to our next speaker, Pilar, who is going to focus a bit more on the process of national reporting and the NBSAP in Mexico. So, Pilar, I'm going to make you presenter so you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Very good. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. And good morning. Thank you everyone for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and be able to share the work that Mexico has been doing regarding mainstreaming gender and biodiversity, specifically for a national biodiversity strategy. Before I start, I want to thank a lot to Andrea Cruz, which is the person in charge for the national strategy process, and she was very fundamental on preparing this talk. So as Marion mentioned, I work at the National Commission of Protected Areas here in Mexico. Very briefly, the content that I want to share with you all today is just kind of the thing that Tanya was mentioning, like why is the need to mainstream gender and biodiversity at a national level. The process that we executed to develop the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan with the gender component, and what were you thinking for our 6th national report regarding gender, which would include case studies that focus on this, on fulfill this Aichi target with the gender component. So why a national strategy with a gender perspective? Well, if we focus on the objective for this strategy, which is to increase the effort and make a positive impact on biodiversity and minimize the direct causes for a loss, is what we know that inadequate use and management of biodiversity is also a consequence of social dynamics. And these dynamics could harm biodiversity. And this is the same as gender. Gender is a result of social and cultural differences that place women on unequal situations. Therefore, if we want to do better for our biodiversity, we must do better for our human relations and build alternative social processes to use and preserve our important ecosystems. In other words, gender perspective and on biodiversity is about creating equal relations on our life that are going to be reflected on biodiversity conservation. The process that we perform to mainstream gender during the design of the national strategy in Mexico and the action plan, we call it Biomex. It was an initiative that was part of a project funded by the Japanese Fund for Biodiversity in collaboration with the CBD Secretariat and the IUCN Gender Office. Mexico was the first pilot country to execute this project, and it was called Capacity Building Initiative to integrate gender in the national strategies and biodiversity action plans. Very important federal organizations were involved and were leading this effort, like the Ministry of the Environment, the Women National Institute, and the National Commission for Biodiversity, including the IUCN, which is a very important support in this process, the Gender Office for the IUCN. So during this initiative, this project, this attempt, there was a 3-day workshop that was held in Mexico City and had the participation over 65 women and men that were working on issues related with gender and biodiversity in Mexico. All these people came together and shared experiences, provide input for the development of this strategy, not only to integrate gender, but also to integrate the gender into the biodiversity line strategies or access, but also into the policy planning programming. So this next slide will help you to understand the general process that was followed. It was not only the workshop was one key element, but the workshop was part of a series of steps. So the first one was the situation analysis. Since the strategy is meant to be a political tool, there was the need to analyze the Mexican the Mexican legal and policy framework on gender and biodiversity to identify gaps or opportunities. And there was also the need to map all those key players that we want to have on board. And after that, a selection of stakeholders was done, and these stakeholders was the one who participated on the following steps. The second step was to establish a common knowledge and platform, because it's still a very difficult topic to understand, like the link between biodiversity, gender. So we needed to perform a capacity building process and a training on gender and biodiversity with all these people that were included in the situation analysis. We were lucky and have experts on gender that help us to perform this capacity building process. And more important, we needed to increase the knowledge about the status of gender and biodiversity in our country. With these stakeholders and with this knowledge, they were able to establish priorities regarding gender and biodiversity. And afterwards, the feedback for the Environmex was received, and the participants were able to develop proposals for the Environmex, how to enhance it, how to be more specific on some action to emphasize on the gender perspective. There was an analysis of all this information, and with all this thinking and writing and exchange of ideas, the group was also able to set some priorities, and these priorities is part of the last step. They went through a validation process and to a public consultations. So at the end of all these steps and process, the gender perspective was included in 19 action lines and 50 specific actions that were in the Environmex, and these actions are held in 3 strategic pillars. So the previous version or the draft version of the strategy was very weak on gender. So I wanted to say that this was a very, very new approach, and it was a highlight of the process and a huge step to engage the public. What were our main results for all this process? A lot of specifications, and generally for the Environmex, emphasize in the inclusion of women as providers and users of scientific and traditional knowledge. And there was a mention that for women as an active part in the planning and implementation of projects focused on conservation and restoration of ecosystems. The managers of biodiversity and implementers of sustainable practices, and we are agent of change to counter environmental degradation, incorporating monitoring and control of pollutants. Women are principal stakeholders in market mechanisms aimed at a fair and sustainable use of resources. And we are a key player in generating changes on environmental, education, and culture. So probably this is not new for you. If any of you have been working on gender issues before, you've been hearing all these statements everywhere. But for this specific people that were specialists on biodiversity with a biological and science background, it was very important to come up with these conclusions that they were able to recognize by themselves. Oh, and last one, women was an active part of the generation of environmental initiative as well as social participation bodies. So this is a big scheme about how the biomex looks like. I'm not going to go through every detail. I just want to highlight for all of you that are in the process or are done with the design process for the national strategy, that it is going to be very important to notice the level of participation that you had and different and make the difference between how men and women were involved, including academic, indigenous people, community. If you show all this menu of different sectors that were involved, it's gonna communicate by itself that we all are making an effort to mainstream the gender. Now, what are we thinking for our sixth national report? The first consideration, and it's very according with what Tanya was saying, is that we want to visualize the woman participation for all the sectors and action and all the institutions that are involved by providing sex disaggregated data. And we're not only focusing on showing the participation, but also promoting it in a way that we can make sure that women will be participating in a free, prior, informed way and ensure that their participation is not going to contribute to gender gaps. I mean, sometimes women needs to, if we want women to participate, that increase the load of work in their other activities. And as well, we want to focus a lot on complementary information like case studies. It's going to be very important for us in this report to recognize, to get to know and to recognize the actions that other sectors are doing to mainstream the gender and biodiversity, to mainstream gender and biodiversity. Probably they're already doing things and they don't have the title on their actions that this is doing for gender and biodiversity. But once we start the dialogue with these sectors, they're going to realize about these links and probably they're going to find the duties or their action are very linked to gender and biodiversity conservation. And gender assessment, we're encouraging all the sector to do the gender assessment, and is going to be very important to show the effort that Mexico is doing on this topic. And lastly, we want to show that a dialogue is creating among the institutions involved. And this dialogue is going to enhance the coordination, the learning, and the sharing of information. So all of these big or small steps is what we're thinking for our national report regarding gender. And it's about to show the process of putting together all the action that all the institutions are doing related to gender and biodiversity. So what I'm also thinking for the national report is case studies. Case studies can show in the very easy way and a very practical managed, in a very practical way to how to incorporate all these recommendations for gender and biodiversity. So right now I'm just gonna talk to you very briefly about one of the important projects that the National Commission of Protected Areas has been doing for the last 5 years, I would say. So this is, I'm gonna take you now to the Gulf of California in Mexico This is a complex. Well, the Gulf of California is located on the peninsula of Baja California, as you can see in the map. This region has more than 300 islands, but we were focusing on a region that has 45 islands, and 2 of them are the biggest of Mexico. This area is known as the Galapagos hemisphere because all this diversity and all this increased amount of species that are living in here, 23 species of marine mammals, 5 species of sea turtle. It's a great place for ecotourism, for diving, and for other economic activities as fishing. So in the protected areas of Mexico, we have a particular situation. These protected areas are now empty. We have an estimated of 3 million people living within the protected areas. And this is telling us that if we want to conserve biodiversity, we need to work with and for the people. So CONAM's missions is to protect the natural capital of the country and all the ecosystem and biodiversity that are inside the protected areas. And therefore, we are considering another important issue, which is climate change. And climate change is threatening the biodiversity and the people. So to evidence the link between climate change, protected areas, people, and we've been trying to do this linkage through the development of climate change adaptation programs for these protected areas. And for the specific climate change program for these great islands that CONAM has developed, it was very interesting the way that the people and the staff from CONAM were approaching this. It was a bit different from the rest of the climate change adaptation program because they focus way more on the social vulnerability assessment. I'm showing you in a very brief in a very concise phrases the steps that we follow to do the climate change adaptation programs. But my colleagues focus in trying to do this vulnerability assessment with a gender perspective. So they held an estimated 61 community meetings, and the highlight of these meetings was that they can show a better link. A better link was made between the conservation targets and the human well-being. And there was a draft version again about this climate change adaptation plan, but after this workshop, another 3 conservation targets were included, and this is because they were able to have the input for all the men and women in an equal participation process. So they were also identified vulnerable places for each locality and through rural maps, and they were different between the men and women. So now we can see where the woman feels more vulnerable and where the man feels more vulnerable. And communitarian projects started with the gender perspective, and an estimated of 9 to 15 strategic actions with gender perspective were endorsed. Also, the social targets that links biodiversity and well-being. So with all this information, we were able to create adaptation measures with a bottom-up focus and have a better understanding about the use of natural resources, the conservation of them, which one are used by men, which one are used by women, what resources belongs to them, how they obtain or how they have access to the resources. So at the end of the day, this specific climate change adaptation program was very close to people and was very close to reality. And our lessons for this is that any conservation plan for biodiversity, for climate change, need to have a gender analysis if we want to work under a gender perspective. Otherwise, we will never going to know what are the specific gaps that we want to eliminate. So taking into account this important consideration, the workshop were also had with a consideration of women, like the time and dates, the date and time that these workshops were held, were considering the men and women activities, and other specific activities like caring for the kids during the workshop, providing environmental education activities while the mothers or while the sisters were attending the workshop. So this was a result of this result in a very interesting participation of all these communities. And I never mentioned that this is indigenous community. So it was another, so this program has like the gender approach and the intercultural focus as well. And well, lastly, I wanted just to conclude with some thoughts and some conclusion that are part of this national process and local process. And it is important to remember, and I'm going to mention again Tanya, because this is very important to have in mind, that the roles determine the relation that women and men have with their natural resources. So before designing a strategy, make sure you have your gender assessment. Otherwise, you will be performing conservation action following stereotypes. To promote equitable participation and decision making, we must understand the root causes of discrimination. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to do the things differently. We need to listen, write down, and promote the woman's knowledge on the use of biodiversity. And we need to make sure we integrate this knowledge into our strategy. There's a need to link the gender action plans under the Convention of Biodiversity with the Gender Action Plan under the UNFCCC. I'm pretty sure, I'm talking this at an international level, but I'm pretty sure that at a national level, there are also different institutions that are developing different gender plans. So we need to make sure that we all are coordinating and talking the same language. There's also a need to promote platforms to exchange lessons learned, tools, good practices in order to mainstream gender and biodiversity. This webinar is a very good example of a way to make sure that we are spreading ideas or good practices. And we need to promote more dialogue with other sectors, with other NGOs, with other international agencies to share all these good practices and try to help each other to face this important challenge. So this is all from my side. Thanks for your attention. I'll stay connected.
Many thanks, Pilar, for this very good presentation and for providing a concrete and technical example of how you integrated women in the national process. Because we had many questions on how to do so, and so thank you for providing this example. I'm sure we will have a few questions after our last speaker. I'm turning over to Mrinalini Rai now, that we can also call Tina. Tina, over to you. I'm going to put you as presenter also, and whenever you're ready to share your screen, please do so and start your presentation. Can you hear us, Mrinalini? I think you're on mute. I don't think we can hear you though, so I'm going to try to unmute you. Can you hear us great? Okay, so we cannot hear you. Could you try to mute and unmute again your microphone, because it was working just before? Or maybe take off or plug your earplugs. Unfortunately, it seems that we cannot hear you. Maybe, Mrinalini, what I would suggest is that you leave the webinar and you try to reconnect. And in the meantime, you try to reconnect exactly the same way we have been doing in the past. And then in the meantime, I can maybe take a few questions from our participants to other speakers. What do you think? Great. So I'm opening the floor for any questions. Mrinalini is going to join back in a few minutes, I'm hoping. Are there any questions so far for our experts, Tanya and Pilar, either on the CBD work on gender, but also on the national process in Mexico and how you could potentially replicate that in your national context at your own level? I think this is a great opportunity for you to ask questions to our experts, especially regarding the 6th National Report process. We have had a lot of questions following the stakeholder engagement webinar on how to engage women's networks and women's groups. So please feel free to ask any questions. I would actually have maybe one question for our participants, for our speakers. How do you address maybe the difficulties presented by the social and cultural and political context? Because maybe in some countries it may be easier. For instance, Mexico may have regulations that are maybe easier and make it easier to integrate women in the process. So would you have any recommendation on what actors to involve, for instance, to make sure that women are at the table? Maybe we can start with you, Pilar, if you have any elements of response.
Well, it was very important for us to do this stakeholders map at the beginning of this process, just to identify this what you mentioned, like if we're gonna have difficulties in integrating this kind of sector, or if we're gonna have difficulties with the particular stakeholder, we need to go slower with them. So we need to strategy to approach them. But the stakeholder maps was very important, just to create alliances, for example, and just to get more partners on this road. So I would recommend, for example, doing this, not just throwing ideas to the air. It's very important to identify the involvement of different sectors, the knowledge that they have, the powers that they have, and trying to get men and women from all the sector. It was very important too.
Thank you. Tanya, do you have anything to add to this?
I agree with Pilar. Stakeholder mapping is a very useful exercise. I think as a basis, and as I mentioned in my last slide, involving ministries responsible for women's affairs or for gender issues is an important step, and as well as women's groups in consultations. I think in a lot of cases, it's just trying to open the communication channels as a starting point with groups that are doing work on gender in the environmental context, and that may be international partners like UNDP and the Jeff Small Grants Program, who are carrying out projects that have a relevance for MBSAP implementation, and other groups at the national level, the local levels, that just may not be well connected and able to share their work and the results of their work as or make it available or make it known to those who are leading the processes on the MBSAP and the 6th National Report. So it's trying to make the most of the resources that are available, I would say, and trying to become more aware of who the actors are that are doing relevant work in the country, and how to then work with them to learn from their experience.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, can I
Yes,
join in? Can you everybody hear me?
I think we can now have Mrinalini. So we received in the meantime a couple of more questions that I'm going to save for after, because I would like to hear the presentation of Mrinalini, and then we can take all the questions from our participants. We can hear you now, Tina. Thanks for coming back. I'm going to turn you as presenter. And whenever you're ready, share your screen. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
No, it's fine. Sorry, for some reason I couldn't unmute myself.
No worries.
So sorry, I don't know what happened.
That happens sometimes. We can hear you now. Feel free to start whenever.
I'm just trying to get the dialog box away. I think, okay, oops. Okay, all right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Mrinalini Rai, and as Marion said before, I work with the Global Forest Coalition, and I work with them on their Community Conservation Resilience Initiative as an advisor for Indigenous Peoples and Gender. And today I will be focusing my presentation on some of the key biodiversity decisions, and including sharing very, very few examples from some of the work that we have done. So one of the basics for my presentation is, first I would like to share a gender perspective on biodiversity, and I think this has been also very well already covered by the previous panelists. The other is the COP13 document on gender mainstreaming. And one very important discussion that will be coming up in July this year during the SBI2 is the agenda that will be addressing once again, the gender mainstreaming. There's some of the findings and reflections from Community Conservation Resilience Initiative and some recommendations. And then looking beyond for a future pathway of how we could strengthen gender mainstreaming in biodiversity in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So gender does definitely matter, and I think some of the key issues that have also been shared are that women are on the front lines of change, regardless of whether we are talking about biodiversity loss or traditional knowledge, or we're talking about climate change and disaster. So there is an increasing role why gender needs to be addressed much more closely with these discussions. So I just took a small part of, thanks to the CBD, instead of reiterating and looking for information. So this is a fact sheet on gender perspective and biodiversity published by the CBD. And this also has a very, very concise data or information that what we have been discussing about. And here we are talking about, like, I've just taken the sector on forestry, and there are already been a lot of research and data that shows that female household members generate about 4 times more forest income than male members, compared with women, and women were able to identify a broader range of plant species, and as Tanya said, about seed banks and about other knowledge, including with health. Just to also reiterate that there is also data that out of the 1.3 billion people living in poverty, 70% of them are women, and 60% of the chronically hungry people are women and girls. And also, but women's role, as much as 60 to 80% of the world's food production, and play a huge role in both water management and forestry. So across the globe, there are already a lot of information, a lot of knowledge already that exists, either it's from civil society organizations, UN agencies, academia, that showcases that women predominates as wild plant gatherers, home gardeners, herbalists, intergeneration transfer of knowledge, and seed custodians. However, in some countries, women have few legal rights to land, and globally, women own less than 2% of the world's titled land. So to build up a basis, this is one of the work that as GFC we do, is we also engage a lot on the policy level, including the CBD discussions. I have other colleagues who follow the climate negotiations. So just taking a quick decision on the last COP, on the 13th decision 13.1, where on section 13 it talks about mainstreaming gender considerations, encourages parties on the national biodiversity strategies and action plans in line with the 2015 to 2020 gender plan of action. Now, what we also did was, and in the same COP, there was also a recognition that the women play a very vital role in mainstreaming biodiversity in not only forestry but also the other sectors. And in line with also keeping with the discussion of sustainable development goals, there was also that recognition and respect to gender mainstreaming to implement the gender plan of action. So Tanya has already, in her presentation in detail, explained about the 2015-2020 gender plan of action. So I'll just quickly skip through this. But what I would like to pay attention is on the the SBI 2 in July on the key agenda items for gender mainstreaming. Now that will be taking place in Montreal from 19th to 13th of July. And some of the key items that I picked up on gender mainstreaming is on item 3, which will be looking at the progress in the implementation of the Convention Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. And the ad document for this is looking at the progress in the implementation of the 2015-2020 Gender Plan of Action. Now, why I'm putting this in my webinar today is because there will be already some discussions on this in July before the parties will have to be submitting the 6NR. So it is also very vital for us as civil society to that we are already reviewing the documents for the meetings and looking at gaps and challenges and any kind of progress that has been made to be able to see how we could also strengthen or capacities or knowledge and also our advocacy to strengthening the agenda of women in the CBD process. So just a quick analysis that I did of the SBI document was that sorry, I'm just trying to minimize my screen here, but I'm losing my, oops. Hi, I hope everybody can still hear me.
Yes, we can.
Sorry, Marian, I'm able to see half my screen. Okay, so what we did was that we reviewed the SBI document, and I just wanted to put this graph on the side. And this is an analysis that was undertaken by IUCN's EGI of all national biodiversity strategies and action plans, available through the Conventions Search portal received by the Secretariat from 1993 to May 2016. And this analysis was also shared during the COP 13. And I'm just going to put this one small paragraph here. And if you look at it, there are women. So out of all the reports that had come in, though the gender was mentioned, if you really look at it, there was a very little emphasis on, you know, we're talking about participation, we're talking about empowerment, we're talking about strengthening gender, but there was very little concrete action plans of how that would be implemented in the national context. So even during the in the SBI paper, there was a review, and the review was done through NBSAPs received following the CBD 10 November 2010 through mid-February 2018 post-Nagoya NBSAPs. And there it's also found that the result of the review were similar to those the review previously undertaken. So even in this new document for July, it again states that primarily the way that gender mainstreaming has been reported in most of the NBSAPs submitted so far is based on awareness raising, and secondly, on increasing women's participation in biodiversity conservation. So as a Global Forest Coalition, as a network of Indigenous peoples organizations and other local organizations, what we have been really striving for is how to really make this into a much more proactive, action-based strategy to be able to support our local partners engaging in national and sub-regional discussions to see how we can strengthen the political will of the governments to see women and gender not just limited to as vulnerable or beneficiary or stakeholders, but rather as agents of change. So, so one of the challenge that we noticed in the national reporting process, which is due for the 6th NR in December 2018, is that in the template, there is, of course, a section on contribution of Indigenous peoples and local communities, but it is optional. And there is no specific section that calls on the contribution or the documentation of the role or the aspirations of women in the national reporting. I'm just wanted to also bring this here because understandably women are stakeholders, understandably that they are Indigenous peoples, but there is definitely a need for, I would say, even the national reporting to have a special section that would actually showcase or have, not a mandatory, but have encourage the parties to document, to put for the targets case studies that also show or reflect the roles that women are playing for biodiversity conservation. So if you just kind of lump it up with stakeholders and mention that the strengthening of women empowerment has been inclusion with strengthening of participation. So how can we really go beyond that and see how we could actually truly have policies that would actually empower the women on the ground who really play a key role in biodiversity conservation. So another thing is also in line, so a lot of the discussions on the CBD has also been on linking the different Rio conventions and building of synergies with the 2030 development agenda and the SDGs. And one of the things that SDG does have is a dedicated target on gender. And when we are talking about gender in goals, and if you're looking at synergies, so we are looking at, say, just one goal for gender. We are talking about access to ownership and control over land. Target 1.4 in poverty eradication also talks about women's ownership and control over land and other forms of property. In goal 2 of the 2.3 of the SDGs, again talks about secure and equal access to land and knowledge, besides other inclusion of women participation in other goals. So linking up that work, what we did was with GFC is that we are working in, so the CCRI is the Community Conservation Resilience Initiative. And we started off with this initiative around 2014. And the aim of this initiative is to contribute to the implementation of the of this Conventional Biological Diversity's 2011-2020 Strategic Plan and ICHA targets by providing policy advice and effective and appropriate forms of support for community conservation. So CCRI is a global initiative that has been documenting and reviewing the findings of bottom-up participatory assessments by some 68 communities in 22 different countries, assessing the resilience of community conservation initiatives and the support that should be provided to strengthen these initiatives, including with a sub-project that we had within it, which is called the Women 2030, and that is looking, and through that we have been doing gender analysis and trying to look at the gaps and challenges of the women in the communities. That includes awareness raising, capacity building, participation in international forums that include the CBD and the UNFCCC discussions. And one of the tasks that we did at for the CCRI partners is that what we really saw, one important aspect which was really very relevant and important to address, was doing a legal review. So some of the legal reviews were took place in different countries by our national partners, trying to assess the role of the policies in line with some of the CBD discussions, and also looking specifically on the rights of women. So what I would do right now is I will just quickly share some 3 examples from the region that I've been working with. So that includes Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka with some of my other colleagues. And why I put, so giving the example of Nepal, everybody knows that, you know, in Nepal, we have a very good policy that also recognizes what's called the community forestry user groups. In Nepal, we have about 15,000 community forest user groups, and within it, each of the forestry user groups is supposed to have women in the decision-making body. However, one of the challenge also within it is that they are part of the forest user groups. However, from the 15,000 plus community forest user groups, there is just maybe approximately 1,000 that are maybe women-led. So there is still a lot of gaps between there are provisions and how they would actually be implemented on the ground. And also, one thing really interesting about Nepal, which I also have put in my recommendation, is that there are also a lot of overlapping of legal provisions. There are different contradictions between the Forest Act 1993, the Environmental Protection Act of 1997, National Parks and Wildlife Conservation Act 1973, and the Local Government Operational Act 2017. As you all might know, that Nepal is just kind of rearing from its new constitution, so it's a very, and recovering from conflict and this recent disaster, so there's still a lot of work going on there. However, so there are provisions for community users, groups, for recognition of traditional knowledge. And also in Nepal's context, there has been the effort by the government to take up the issue of gender mainstreaming. However, those policies are not reflected, say, for example, the budgeting. So there is, you know, the budgeting part does not take that into consideration. So there are kind of these loopholes that there is good intention, but then how do you really ensure that those intentions actually get reflected in the actions that are being planned by the governments, including with different institutions, including ministries. So all these acts that are there in Nepal have created judicial overlapping in terms of decision-making power, collection of tax and royalties, and decisions on forest land tenure rights, which is required to address through a harmonized way, and considering the rights of community conservation and community forest groups. And like I said, that one of the frontline issues also in Nepal in the recent years, indirectly linked with biodiversity, is migration. So why I feel that why gender should be a very important component in the national policies is because Nepal in the recent years has seen a lot of exodus of young people into the Middle East and other parts of, I mean, mostly in this part of the world, and this is even about maybe 400,000 plus people, and with that, the gender roles are changing in the communities. You know, where the work of the women were limited to harvesting or seed, now they're having to look for markets, they're having to look at other alternatives. So it has also created a gender balance, which in a way, again, has got multiple complex levels. Like we were talking about how gender analysis is very important because, you know, you can look at empowerment of women in community conservation because there are no men, so they're taking these roles. But if the provisions are not there to really look at how they would be able to have their rights not only respected but recognized, then you also have a gap on how they would work on the ground, including awareness raising. And of course, one of the challenges with the communities in the far regions is communication. So how one of the things that Tanya suggested, looking at that on action, is that you know, could be not only gender budgeting, but also be looking at community radio. So those are kind of initiatives that the government could build on or strengthen. The other quick example I wanted to give is from India. Now, India's Forest Rights Act is actually quite inclusive. However, again, there's a lack of implementation because some of the challenges that as Indigenous peoples we face, and as a civil society, has also been working for the recognition of the UN DRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But however, on the bright side, I wanted to showcase this study because here in this community, the women have taken the role on themselves to be the leaders, to be the heroes of the community. So these women from the Gundri Bandi tribal village in the eastern Indian state of Odisha patrol the forest to prevent illegal logging. So around 27 households are working with fellow residents to map the boundaries of this 200-hectare forest that the community claims as a customary land. At the forefront of the movement are women from tribal communities in states like Odisha who are determined to make full use of a 2012 amendment to India's Forest Act. A provision of the amendment, FRA, gave forest dwellers and tribal communities the right to own, manage, and sell non-timber forest products. So, which some 100 million landless people in India depend on for income, medicine, and housing. So some 850 villages in the Nayagar district of Odisha states are collectively managing 100,000 hectares of forest land, with the result that over half of the district's land mass now has forest cover, more than double India's national average of 21%. And another sharing from this community is that the women are the ones who started this movement. The women started, and it has not only empowered them, but it has also empowered other people, including the youth, to take an interest in their ecosystems, in their customs, in their cultures. So just a small example of this community is that in this community, there are just 27 households and owing barely a hectare of land each. But as rain falls on farms in the foothills of the village, it carries nutrients-rich humus from the forest, enriching the soil and adding to the bounty of crops and wild food. The soil is so packed with nutrients that each hectare provides around 6,500 kgs of rice each harvest, 3 times more than on farms near unprotected forests. This is one of the things that the locals have shared. The forest also provides a range of seasonal food for local families, as well as extra income for medicinal plants that can be sold in the market. Now you can also link this up with not only the role of women in conserving biodiversity, but also linking it to people's well-being. We're talking about medicinal plants. You're talking about intergenerational transfer of knowledge, and we're also talking about being the custodians of their environment, of the biodiversity that surrounds them. And a lot of these, when you're talking about seasonal food and local seasonal food, you're talking about medicinal plants. Now this is linked up to the traditional knowledge of these women, of the villagers at the local level, of the species that surround them. In the initial first slide that I showed of the fact sheet by the CBD, also reiterates the same fact that a lot of analysis has shown that if you go to a community and you're supposed to ask the different gender roles in biodiversity, there is differentiated contributions by both men and women. And this is also a very good practice or a good example from the ground, how these women are doing or taking these initiatives by their own, and how so it becomes very important and necessary to also be able to help them safeguard their knowledge, because now you have into the ongoing work on Nagoya Protocol, which we're talking about access and benefit sharing. And so how do you really localize these processes and these strategies, which are very far removed from the local level, even to the national level, and even to the regional and international. So this case I wanted to also share also is in regard to Tanya's presentation on target 13 on looking at one of the way forward, is looking at in situ conservation initiatives. These can take the place of what we have also been working with the ICCA consortium that has been working on areas and territories, the recognition of areas and territories by Indigenous peoples and local communities. And within the discussion of the CBD, there is a growing recognition of these other effective area-based management systems. And it would be interesting to see the documentation of those initiatives in the NBSAPs, because the contribution of other effective area-based management system, other ICCAs, community forestry, sacred forest, if you were to really lump up all these other so-called community-led conservation initiatives, I think it would, and I think there has also been research that they would actually contribute or would go over the commitments of the CBD or the SDGs on the increase of terrestrial ecosystems. So how do you also bring about then the roles of women within it, because a lot of these structures are also very relevant for the basic lives of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and then within that structures of women, of youth, and other marginalized groups within those systems. So next, I wanted to share with you a case from Malaysia, from Sabah, Malaysia.
Tina, I'm just asking you to maybe present this case study a tiny bit faster, because we have 30 minutes left, and I really would like to have time for the questions from our participants. Thank you.
Okay, because he told me to do more of like local based initiative. Okay, so quickly, so just on this initiative is that in Sabah, Malaysia, we have been working with our local partner Tacos, and they have been working on a lot of different, they've identified a lot of the threats and also been working on different initiatives to work. So one of the community is looking at the restoration of mangroves and developing community protocols. So communities are engaged with other communities and NGO for support and also fact fighting. Because one of the issues pertaining to this particular community is the development of shrimp farming. So that has been a really big challenge. So if you look at the map there, that is the shrimp farm project that was proposed. So there has been like so the community has been fighting back to get the rights to their community forestry, so they would be able to regenerate and rehabilitate this mangrove forest. This is just a testimony from one of the community members from this community from Sabah, Malaysia, and I will skip that part. So just from the key findings is that protecting national traditional communities' conservation practices and promoting ecosystem habitats regeneration is a priority. Respecting and implementing Indigenous peoples, local communities, and women's human rights and the rights to govern their lands and resources is fundamental to their capacity to continue conserving biodiversity. Involving women is essential to protecting and recovering traditional knowledge, practices, capacities, and resilience, and supporting productive strategies that promote traditional community livelihoods and well-being will promote biodiversity conservation. And the support of education for communities and other about rights drivers of change and the environment is vital. So just to briefly, this is a key finding from our draft report, from a global report, which we are actually working on right now, collecting all these case studies, and we will be publishing this global report during the CBD meeting in July. Again, the conclusion is that, again, being covered that data desegregation of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including of women, poor, and others, should be included. States are usually good at formulating gender equality and social inclusion policies. I give the example of Nepal. However, there's a need to address and strengthen the synergies between gender policies and forest policies. There's a need better integration of the contributions of women in reporting of both the SDGs and CBD's national reports. Because how do you really build the synergies? Because they do their own reports, like the SDGs, though voluntary, have the volunteer national reporting. And in July, SDGs 15 is being addressed this year in New York. So how do you also build synergies between these reports and the CBD national reports? There's a need for recognition of the roles of women as stewards and as agents of change and biodiversity conservation. This is just a quick graph that I adapted from EC Mode based in Nepal on how to look at a gender transformative change. I think I can answer a lot of these issues have already been covered by Tanya, and also some of these issues were also I'm happy to say I saw that also in the Mexico case study. So I will just move through this. And also this, but again, I'll quickly mention this. Gender sensitive indicators, both quantitative targets and qualitative interpretations with gender sensitive indicators to be developed, tools and methods to ensure gender sensitive M&Es, There needs to be gender-sensitive technology. There's gender budgeting, and of course, capacity building. And I should say that I wanted to give more example, but a quick thing that some of this partners that we've been working with have been using the work of the participatory mapping process, which has been really very great in also motivating the indigenous peoples and local communities, including women, because that ensures their participation in recognizing the different resources, the different use areas within their community conservation or within protected area systems. Sorry, I'm going to quickly go through this. Gender disaggregated data, already covered, and also partnership and coordination. In this, I just wanted to also share that partnerships and networks should be built and strengthened to promote gender mainstreaming within the biodiversity conservation and management. This should also include women's organizations, including CSOs, local organizations, and networks also, like, because as GFC, we are part of the Women's Major Group and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, and things like IIFB and the CBD Alliance, and all these networks are loose networks, but they're also working, do policy review, working on the ground, working with different groups in country, nationally, locally, regionally. So this is also a pathway of how the governments and the local governments in the national context for the NBSATs could reach out to also have them as partners in sharing work on gender, mainstreaming gender and biodiversity, building complementarities between Goal 5 and the ICHA targets, and harmonizing between different sectoral strategies, like I talked about. How do you really build up these linkages and harmonizing even within national context with different ministries and different departments, in particular to gender mainstreaming. I think I'm done with the last two slides. And what I see on the positive side is that there is still time, because and to ensure that the work of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, so contributing to development and post-2020 framework. And these are the things that are still discussed, contributing to the gender plan of action and progress towards implementation. And one of the work that GFC, together with the partners, what we have been doing is definitely keeping our track up and trying to also give formal submissions to the Secretariat, using all these examples and good practices for the policy discussions. And that is from Iran, from Sinesta and UNINOMAD, the Federation of Nomadic Communities. And these women are the community members who are also trained participatory mapping trainers who have been taking mapping in their communities. And that is about it. Sorry for rushing down the last few slides.
Thank you, Tina. We're going to share the presentation anyway with participants, so they will be able to maybe focus a bit more on the last case study, especially. I just wanted to take a bit of time with all the participants now to take questions from you. You have 3 strong experts in gender from different backgrounds, and I would really encourage you to take and make the most out of this conversation for your national context and the process of writing and preparing the 6th national report. We have received a question from Manal Aziza. Manal, I'm gonna open your microphone, and if it's working, you can ask directly your question to the speakers. It's always better to have a conversation directly. Can you hear us, and can you speak?
Okay.
I'm hearing you. What is your question?
My question is if one of the presenter can give me an example of the 6 disaggregated data.
So
Is
an
any
example.
example on 6 disaggregated data that should be used in the 6NR report?
Sure. Thank you for your question. Maybe we can
And
start.
there is another question, please.
Of course, go ahead.
In the gender plan in the 6NR project, it was shown that there must be the project team should involved with the training courses on gender mainstreaming, and we all the project team in Iraq listening to this webinar. Can this be one of the achievement or one of the achievement that we are all now in training on this gender mainstreaming? Can this achieve?
Yes, so I can answer the last question. Yes, it is one of the training. This definitely can be considered one of the training that you should be following. So all good for that. And I think I will turn over maybe first to Tanya for the first question. Do you have in mind any sex disaggregated data? And other speakers are also welcome to join and share their answer. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yes, this is Tanya. Some of the data that comes to mind, and I think I mentioned there isn't a lot that's sort of globally available, but at different levels we have data. We can point to how data could be collected. One is for Target 1 that I spoke to in my presentation, the values that people hold regarding biodiversity. There has been some analysis of men's and women's different biodiversity values in different countries. So there has been an organization that has taken surveys and been able to collect some data that reflects differences between women and men in their understanding and how they value biodiversity. I would also refer to things like the under Target 14, where it talks about taking into account women's needs of for the restoration and management of ecosystems that are providing essential services. If there is some assessment that can be undertaken at either at the local level or at a higher level of what ecosystems are, what who is using which ecosystems and what are the priority services that they have. So looking at those elements of use, it's trying to identify within that if there's a difference between women and men. So trying to collect data, at least at some level, that reflects what women are using, particularly what services they're using in a particular ecosystem or watershed, let's say, and what men are using. So trying to break it down from not just a household or a community level, but actually what different people are using in the ecosystems. So those are two that come to mind right off the bat. But then there's other things like land ownership, access to agricultural services, doing an analysis of where women versus men have access to different services, and that may be in at a specific realm, such as what type of agricultural extension services are available, how many agriculture extension service providers or workers are women versus how many are men. So those are just some analyses that give us a sense of what is the proportion of women and men in these different processes or in these different sectors even, and by that basis we can infer different things. But it could, alternatively, another element is looking at community management groups for different sectors, such as forestry or fisheries, and seeing how many of those groups, how many women are in those groups and how many men are in those groups. So it does require likely working with organizations that are working with communities, or looking at your national censuses and municipal censuses to find where there's data already being collected that reflects some relationship to natural resource management, or otherwise trying to work with gender experts to really identify where you can add questions to your census, to your standard collection of official statistics, so that you are collecting more relevant information that can allow better policy and decision making. So those are a few suggestions that come to mind, and I don't know if my other panelists, others on the panel, may have other suggestions to add.
Okay, thank you so much for this. Perfect. It's clear. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Tanya, for this element of response. Do we have maybe more response from Pilar and Mrinalini? Do you want to contribute, or you think that Tanya's response is good enough?
This is Pilar. I think Tanya just explained it very well, and just mention again, for example, make sure during, not at the end is going to be very hard to, so just make sure that from the very beginning you're thinking on this, and all your planning is thinking on the segregated data. Otherwise, if you want to do it at the end, it's going to be impossible. Just think about gathering these data, since the planning stage is going to be helpful too.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We have maybe a couple of more minutes to take a few more questions. So far, I do not see any hand raised or questions written. I would strongly encourage you to take this moment as an opportunity to ask all the questions you may have regarding gender and women's involvement in the 6NR to our speakers. This is an occasion that you may not have again after that. Are there any remaining questions for now? Last call. All right. Well, I'm gonna then maybe just turn over to our speakers for any concluding remarks, and then feel free to share with me any question in the meantime. Tanya, do you have any last words for these sessions, maybe?
Thanks very much, Mariel, and thanks all to our listening. I guess I would suggest if you spend some time to take a look at what's available on the CBD gender web pages. We do have the guidance that I mentioned that is relating to integrating gender considerations in the development of MBSAPs, but that also should give you a sense of, in the reporting, what elements are important to reflect, and what things you may already be doing that you might not have labeled as gender responsive, or give you an indication of what you can do differently and better going forward. Because I think the reporting process provides that opportunity, in that it is an assessment of progress, and also an opportunity for reflection, and to maybe better plan next steps for implementation. And as I mentioned, also the pilot project that we conducted, that Pilar illustrated in respect to the work that was done with Mexico. There is the document that includes some considerations of what came out of that whole process, and I think that sort of consolidates some of the issues and some of the needs in addressing gender considerations. Aside from those things, I guess I would also encourage you to engage on the MBSAP forum. There are quite a lot of resources available there as well related to gender, but also I'm here at the Secretariat. I'm a team of one, but I am doing my best to provide other guidance and materials for parties to support gender responsive approaches. And I guess the other thing I can say to that Tina referred to in some ways, is that we really need parties to raise these issues and to take an interest in, and engage on gender, and putting forward approaches to gender issues and women's involvement in decisions under the convention. So if you are engaged at the upcoming SBSTA and SBI meetings, that's an opportunity to really take a look at the sectors, the decisions that you are engaged on as a delegation, and to see where there might be an opportunity to really take a gender focus and ensure that women's needs and interests are incorporated in those decisions and the implementation of those decisions. And also, as mentioned, there is going to be there's a progress report that's now available on the website for the upcoming meetings for SBSTA and SBI that talks about as a progress review of the implementation of the CBD Gender Plan of Action to date. So that can give you some overview of what is happening in terms of MBSAP MBSAP development as a whole, and other elements. We also undertook a survey looking at to what extent parties and other partners may need or be interested in capacity building in relation to the Rio Convention, so in relation to the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. So there's some interesting elements in that document that I would encourage you to review, and there will be shortly also an information document with more detail on the different analyses that were undertaken. So those are some things for the time being that may help inform your work. And as I mentioned, or as I illustrated in this presentation, I will be producing, or the Secretariat will be producing this year. We're making available a guidance document on gender linkages with the Aichi targets, and that goes into some more detail from what was presented in the slides today. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Tanya. Thanks a lot. And thank you for all the work that the CBD is doing to ensure gender and women taken into consideration in the national process, especially the reporting one. Pilar, do you have a few words, concluding words you'd like to share?
Thank you, Marian. Well, there's still a lot of things that haven't been said, and there's still a lot of discussion that we can just spend hours. But I just want to share with you all the tools that we are also being developed at the National Commission of Protected Areas. We have a lot of material like agendas, the description of the workshop that we held, and the guide and the methodology for all this exercise, and that help us to do a more gender specific or gender with a gender perspective workshop. And I could share along with the presentation with you the links where you can find them. They're meant to be flexible, and obviously there needs to be adapted to every single context. But if you go through them, it will help you to give you an idea of what other things you can do. And another important thing is just to be creative. Like when we talk about gender, we talk about tradition, we talk about history. So if we want to work in gender, it's time to be creative and innovate. Be trying to do more new things that you never could imagine, because this is the things that we need, like do things in a different way that help us to stop doing all the action that are not gender friendly. So that's all from me. Thank you all of you for being here, and thank you for all the speakers. It was very, very interesting. I took very interesting notes, so looking forward to read all the reports, and looking forward to be in touch and get to know more about this CBD work, gender.
Thank you, Pilar. And Tina, maybe? I think it's... Oh, perfect. We can hear you, Tina, now.
All right. Yes, I would first thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to also share some of the experiences that we have been working with. And also just, I don't have to add much more on what Tanya and Pilar just said. Just as coming from a civil society perspective, I think, first, I definitely would like to say that I feel that there is still space and room to make this better. That there are not only from our GFC, but within CBD, within a lot of the other agencies, are very good examples on the ground that showcase the contributions of women and what they've been doing. And I also take the opportunity to thank the Secretariat and NBSAP, and also delegates and parties like Mexico who have taken really, for me, it's been really very nice to see the extent to which Mexico has also gone to ensure that their NBSAP is gender responsive. So I really do hope that these kind of sharing would also happen between delegates, to also share from each other of how those processes worked or not worked, or challenges. I do know that sometimes some things are much more easier said than done, like data desegregation. There's a lot of different tasks, but also to say that there are a lot of networks, a lot of allies, and you have the Indigenous Peoples Biodiversity Network, you have the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network, you have a CBD Alliance Network, ICC. So there are a lot of allies that the Secretariat, of course, has been working with, and also encourage the delegation, the parties, to engage with and take the opportunity if you are coming to the CBD discussions. And I think most of us would be more than happy to also get the opportunity to speak and to share some of these experiences, tools that we've been using, and also share experiences within each other, and also challenges, because I suppose some of the challenges, could be very similar. So yeah, so I think I would say that look forward to the next discussion. And if any of the listeners out here would be at the CBD July meeting, we will be happy to also take this discussion further. So thank you very much also, Marion, for this opportunity to be here.
Thank you a lot. Yes, we look forward to meeting as many people as possible during SEPSTA. So that leads us to the end of this webinar session. Thank you again to Tanya, Pilar, Mrinalini for your time and your guidance on gender and biodiversity conservation activities. Thank you to all the participants who attended the session one more time. So we're having this session in French starting in an hour, and the Spanish session from 2 to 4 p.m. New York time next Monday on the 4th of June. We will share the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, in English, French, and Spanish via email and on the NBSUP forum. And the recording of this session and the upcoming ones will also be uploaded on the NBSUP forum YouTube channel, as we do usually. I also want to inform you all that there is another webinar session that will be hosted on the use of indicators in the 6th National Report project. That will be presented by Philip Bubb from UN Environment and Robert Oft from CBD. The English session will be hosted on Tuesday, 19 June, and we will provide more information regarding the French and Spanish sessions shortly. If you would like to focus on one more specific topic or any questions for the upcoming webinar sessions, please send us an email with your suggestions. You can send an email to Christina. You can also send an email to Martin and I, as you've been doing since a few months now. We look forward to continue our collaboration to prepare high quality, data-driven, and gender-focused 6NR. Thank you again to all of you, and have a very good day. This concludes the webinar.